Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Peter Pringaman. I am the Associated Press Global Climate and Environment News Director. Welcome to Power Politics, brought to you by Project Syndicate and Sustainable Energy for All. We are broadcasting from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Today we're going to be talking about the intersection of geopolitics and energy transition. And I'm delighted to be joined by a terrific panel that is going to share their insights with us. First, Dr. Kanda Yumkela, a member of parliament in Sierra Leone, former CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, and founder and CEO of the Energy Nexus Network. Bernard DeSanto, the COO of the AES Corporation. And finally, Jason Bordoff, co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, Columbia University that is, and founding director of the Center of Global Energy Policy and a professor of professional practice at the International and Public Affairs School at Columbia University. The transition to green energy was always going to be complicated, with bursts of progress at some points and barriers that had to be overcome along the way. And if you think back historically, how we power all human activity has always had challenges. When cities started really getting big in the 19th century, for example, the poop from horses and carriage, was a big problem that had to be confronted. Now, this is an example often cited, but I think it speaks to the fact that there are always challenges. And then since then, at every stage, there have been changes in energy, there have been challenges. And these challenges have really been overcome by learning from experience, experimentation, innovation, technology, and the kind of sharing that happens in a global world. Russia's decision to invade Ukraine in February and all that has happened since has taken what was always going to be complicated, a transition of green energy and the geopolitics, and made it even more complicated. Or perhaps it made it less complicated. That's something that we've heard debated in the last couple of days, and that has been debated since the invasion began in February, and we're probably going to talk a little bit about it today. Perhaps it's made some things more clear. Since the invasion, we've heard many arguments, and different countries have made different decisions with regard to their energy policy. There are those that argue that the energy crunch that's resulted, particularly in Europe, is reason to double down on green technologies, on green energies, and make sure that no nation is ever dependent on fossil fuels from a country like Russia. At the same time, there are those who argue that that's just not realistic. We can't double down on green energy investments when there's so much acute need for energy right now and energy prices are skyrocketing. And often included in that argument is the contention that nations with fossil fuels should actually double down their production on fossil fuels to make sure that they're not dependent. So these are some of the things that we're going to talk about. Bernard, I want to start with you, just to give us your perspective on the situation from the standpoint of industry.
Yes, thank you very much. First, let me thank for being here again. Welcome to the Sustainable Energy for All, and let's try to do. There is big COVID, and war actually has put a very big challenge in front of us. So, as an industry, when we actually look at this, it's our belief that it's a short-term problem that we actually have the tools in order to solve. The second part is we are in an environment where scarcity has shifted to supply chain, but it's not the only problem. And the demand for energy security has to come to a big play, as you mentioned. And that is actually demanding a lot of renewable technology in place. In our case, in AES, we have more customers and markets demanding from us renewable technology in order to beat the climate change. At the same time, we have a scarcity in the supply chains. That is one of the problems that I would like to mention, but it is a short-term problem, and is only one of the angles that we need to tackle. There are other two that are controllable for our governments, markets, and actually authorities that is related to interconnection scarcity, land and interconnection, and the other one that is related to interconnection scarcity, and the other one that is related to I will come that in a minute. So sorry that I missed that part. So when we look at the supply chains, and we actually are working on that, bring a lot of opportunity in diversity of the supply chain, in nearshoring, for example, for all Latin America, also for other countries in Asia. There is a problem that we can see in a 1-2 years issue. When we look at these 1-2 year issues that we are working on, the way that we have stand as an AES, we have not actually stopped our growth. We continue in the pace in order to continue to develop renewables in every market and to every customer that had set challenges, targets in order to become a zero carbon or carbon-free emission in a short period of time, based 2030, 2040, 2050. The way that we have stand is we are backing up and standing by in all of our contracts, in all of our acceleration. We have not slowed down. We are managing and absorbing the complexity of the supply chain for ourselves, keeping in mind that the first objective is energy security, and the second objective is actually cleaning the electricity that we produce. We cannot slow down our pace. We need to continue to move forward, and we're working in extreming in relations with every supplier in order to manage the delays, changing the slope, changing the sequence of our projects, and order to continue to deliver what is the more important goal, that is actually to continue to that pace. That will bring a bridge in order that we actually can solve the other problems that we also have, that is permits, that is actually controllable for cities, government, and federations in every of the countries that we have. Is one of the issues that we have in order to actually accelerate that future of energy. And the second that I was mentioning, interconnection and scarcity. These last two is based on investment, government willingness to do and to act, and corporate actually to develop the projects in order to fulfill that gap. The quickly we do it, the quickly we can actually solve it, and we can manage the transition that the supply chain scarcity had put in place, not only for corporations, for markets and communities in emerging markets or developing markets, in order to actually move quickly to a green environment that is 24/7 carbon free in every minute and in every hour of the day.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Well, for the next question, I want to first introduce a new panelist who just arrived, Varun Sivaram. He is the Senior Director for Clean Energy and Innovation, U.S. Department of State. Welcome. Good to have you here with us as well. Oh, no problem. Is your mic working? Can we hear you?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, the next question I have for you is the U.S. really girded itself, protected itself by building energy independence over the last several years, going from net export of oil to a net import of oil to a net exporter. So has what's happened now with the invasion, with the rise of prices at the pump, particularly we just had the elections, this was a big election issue. Has this caused the U.S. government to rethink its policies and to look at energy efficiency and gas as increasing priorities in the energy transition?
Thanks so much. First of all, let me say everything I have probably learned about energy independence or putative energy independence, I learned from my friend Jason Bordoff. And a critical insight is, we are never extricated from global energy markets. Even if we are a net exporter, for example, of oil and gas, it is still the case that prices for oil are set on a global market, and we face those global prices. So it's another thing, by the way, and I'll try and say things that are not just quoting Jason, but another thing Jason said is a critical part of this energy transition is going to be reducing the demand for unabated fossil fuels as we move to clean energy as a first best approach to insulating ourselves from the volatility of fossil fuel prices. And I think this administration has taken I'll say it, unprecedented, historic steps to do just that through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the bipartisan infrastructure law. In the United States, we will, over the next decade, achieve, for example, 50% new electric vehicles by 2030, and 80% carbon-free power grid will reach our emission reduction threshold. And largely, this will be on the back of changing the demand for unabated fossil fuels and increasing the supply of clean energy alternatives. I do want to make the point, though, and we should go here if you have time for another question, that there is a whole new set of geopolitical consequences of the clean energy transition. And our legislation takes the first steps toward, for example, developing new supply chains for the clean energy products and materials of the future. And again, we're going to need to work both on the supply side and the demand side. That's why I'm proud that yesterday, President Biden's senior advisor, John Podesta, along with Secretary John Kerry, and the president himself in a fact sheet, announced a new expansion of the First Movers Coalition to drive demand for the next generation of clean technologies in sectors where we traditionally have not had alternatives. Again, to drive demand for clean technologies that don't use unabated fossil fuels, which is our first best approach to insulating ourselves from volatility of those markets.
Okay. I mean, is it fair to say, though, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act was made after the invasion of Ukraine, is it fair to say that has changed somewhat U.S. policy, U.S. energy policy, post-invasion? I mean, everything that you lay out makes sense, but I just wonder, like, if there are some parts that you've seen change in these last 8 months.
Look, we're facing a fairly historic energy crisis. It's important to be responsive. You saw, for example, how we were responsive right after the crisis. We, with our European allies, announced plans to support them, and we have continued to do so. We've done so both by ensuring that they have energy security through American exports and through helping our European allies to reduce their demand and consumption of Russian gas, which is a critical thing that they can do principally through clean energy deployment across power, residential heating, industrial consumption. So yes, we're obviously responsive. You've seen other moves where the United States government, using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has made sure to make moves to support the market dynamics we want to see. But fundamentally, the strategy hasn't changed. It's been 2 years. On day one, President Biden came in, made climate one of his 4 historic pillars, right? Along with, for example, COVID and fighting for racial equity. And what President Biden said is, because of this historic pillar, this priority of climate, we're going to transition to clean energy faster than ever before. That hasn't changed. No matter what crisis affects the world in the near term, we're on a glide path toward reducing and ending our dependence on unabated fossil fuels, and then helping our allies do the same. And right now in Europe, the best thing they can do is not replace gas with only gas. It's going to be critical for Europe this year, next year, and this decade, under the REPowerEU plan, which is actually excellent, to move strongly toward renewable energy. And the key things that we're going to have to deal with in this new world, Jason's written a lot about it, is the geopolitics of the clean energy transition. For example, China refines 70 to 90% of 5 major battery materials and minerals: nickel, cobalt, lithium, copper. In each of these, and by the way, the lead time to build out a refining capacity is 5 years or more, but the effects of a shock to supply are far less than that time frame. Because of that mismatch, it's important now to do our strategic planning to make sure that those supply chains are secure going forward. That'll be different than the oil supply chains, for example. We're probably, our economy is far more exposed to an oil shock. An oil shock would permeate in far more profound ways than a battery mineral shock. But nevertheless, it's important to prepare for some of those eventualities as we move to a clean energy economy.
All right, thank you. So, Candid, I want to switch to you here. Sub-Saharan Africa is really in the spotlight at this year's COP. This is, of course, a COP in Africa. And there's a lot of talk of an equitable energy transition and creating space for African countries to really carve their own energy transition pathways toward net zero. However, I'm really struck as a journalist of the gap, the reality gap between what's needed and what's being promised and what's actually being delivered. We see that in lots of areas, whether it's climate finance, we see it whether we talk about adaptation, mitigation efforts to help developing countries. So I wonder, how in your view can African countries really navigate this time of challenge, particularly in the environment and in this environment, and cut through like all the distractions, all the noise?
It is very difficult for African countries just because of COVID, 2 years of COVID. Already investments in the energy sector dropped by 30% already before the current war in Europe. We worry that the current war in Europe might also cause a shift from energy solidarity to more energy sovereignty. Countries that typically would support African energy transition are looking within because they have their own difficulty. And we need that solidarity because we don't have the resources we need to be able to achieve energy access, for example. Also, we are already suffering the impacts of climate change, even though we emit less. So for us, from a multilateral standpoint, we worry that the war would cause more energy focus on energy sovereignty than the energy solidarity we need to provide the resources and the support needed for Africans to manage the energy transition. We also worry that the conflict we see now is also creating a trust deficit. You need nations in the multilateral system, whether at climate or the World Bank or at the UN, to sit together to look at the world as one common earth that we all have. So if these conflicts take place, it reduces the trust to even negotiate very honestly. The second issue is what our colleague just mentioned. There's going to be a scarcity of resources we need for the global energy transition. A lot of those minerals we need are in Africa. I just learned last week from one of the major corporations involved in the copper business that, look, the electric cars will use 10 times more copper than the normal cars. He said, but we need a whole lot of copper for the transmission lines for the future. Africa sits on a lot of that copper, cobalt. We sit on maybe 40% or more, manganese, and the key minerals, even the platinum group of metals that you need. So for us in Africa, as we look at this mineral scarcity, the question is, how can we add more value to those minerals so that we can benefit more in terms of jobs and wealth creation, rather just the interest to exploit it out of Africa into other places? The third element is the whole debate on gas. We see an interest now, a sudden interest in African gas. We're happy. But is it a short-term interest? Is it an interest that will say, look, we must accept that the energy transition in Africa is not just about decarbonization. We don't have the energy to start with. Our energy demand is going to triple by 2040. We're going to add another 1 billion people to the African population. We need jobs. We need wealth creation. So this new interest in gas, whether it's hydrogen gas, as the Europeans, we're making a deal with the Europeans now to look at how Africa can be a major supplier of green hydrogen, which North Africa, Namibia, and others have the potential of doing. But could it be the opportunity that we develop these resources so that we meet our energy needs? Still, over 600 million people in Africa without access to electricity right now. If we add another 1 billion Africans by 2045, 2050, you're talking about planning an energy transition for over 1 billion people. And we need that solidarity. That's why I started with the whole discussion of energy solidarity. Let me say that still today, less than 2% of the investments in renewable energy goes to Africa. Jason and I were having a discussion on regulation. We need to develop proper regulation. We need to develop those markets. And we need the solidarity support from other regions and other economies to make that happen. So whether it's the resource constraint, we don't want to see our nations just become another supplier of raw materials. Can value be added? Can we be the battery producers? Because we're sitting on the bulk of the cobalt, manganese, and magnesium needed, or nickel needed for those battery systems. Can that be a better relationship, whether it's with the United States, China, Europe, whoever, that some value addition has to take place in Africa, so we are part of the supply chain or the global value chain for the key minerals and components that are needed for the global energy transition.
No, I would add to that, it's important for journalists to be on the ground in Africa as we are, to really look at all of these things and the trade-offs, the relationships, the labor, to make sure it's not just exploitation, right?
Well, let me add the security dimension. I think the world has to pay attention. In the United States, I was there during September for the UN General Assembly. When I see people complaining about 8% inflation, I say, come to my neighborhood. In a number of our countries, the price of fuel at the pump went up 100% within 2 months because of the crisis. Food price inflation is 25-30% in some countries. It is no surprise there were riots in Ghana this past week. There's a huge security dimension to this. I can see we had riots in my country in August. I can see major collapse of governments if this inflation trend continues, which for Europe means, again, significant migration. But for the United States and others, we're talking about global security here. So there are dimensions of this crisis and the geopolitics that says, look, we better have more solidarity, we better have more honest dialogue than just everybody looking at their own energy security.
Well, that provides a really good segue for a question that I want to ask you, Jason. Given everything that he said, security, all the competing interests, with all these geopolitical forces at play, is it too late for a reset on the energy transition that's backed by the private sector and governments like worldwide? I mean, have we missed that moment with everything going on?
Yeah. Well, you don't get a reset on your carbon budget. The carbon budget is what it is. So when you lose 1 or 2 decades or more, we are where we are. We're not going to roll that clock back. But as someone who has spent his career coming to the work of climate change through a background in foreign policy and national security and geopolitics, it's both distressing but exciting to see the increased prominence that foreign policy and geopolitics plays at a COP like this, because we can't have a clean energy transition unless we manage the geopolitical risks along the way. And we have thought, not enough, but I think there is recognition that climate change itself is a massive geopolitical risk: conflicts, refugees, migration, water scarcity. I think too often in the past, we had thought of energy geopolitics in the context of oil and gas, and if we reduce the need for oil and gas, we won't worry about OPEC, we won't worry, if you're in Europe, about Russia. And I wrote with my colleague Megan O'Sullivan in Harvard a piece in Foreign Affairs before Russia invaded Ukraine about why all of that may be true, and yet the energy transition itself, if we have one, and we should remember we're barely having one today, other than a recession or a pandemic, emissions go up each and every year. But if we accelerate the clean energy transition we so desperately need, it is going to be one of the most massively disruptive geopolitical forces of the 21st century. And so when you look at what Varun said about what the US government is doing, and I don't think there's been a change in strategy. I think it's go big on climate, accelerate a transition. The Inflation Reduction Act is a historic opportunity to reduce demand. It doesn't happen overnight. And if you're in Europe and you're looking about how quickly what can you do to find alternatives to Russian gas? Well, you could put heat pumps in homes, but that doesn't happen by next winter or the winter after. And those transitions take time. And that process of transition, is going to potentially create new risks, like dependence on critical minerals, global trade in green hydrogen or green ammonia that are subject to supply chain, sea lane risks that oil markets face today. The tensions we see on such stark display here that are growing, not shrinking, between developing and developed countries. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a historic achievement, but to build that political coalition is industrial policy with protectionism built into it, and says if you want those tax credits, you need to make things in the US or sometimes friendly or neighboring countries, and that could spark a backlash if we're not careful and we don't manage those trade risks along the way. So you kind of go down the list, and you say, in order to have the clean energy transition we need to like clear the runway of all these potential pitfalls. And I think this is highlighting the ways in which we need to do that. And then there's this process of transition, right? We are spending a lot of time thinking about how to get through this coming winter in Europe. We have spent a lot of time at COP after COP talking about the destination, net zero by 2050, driven by the science, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and what's it going to take to get there. We can't weaken those goals. We haven't spent enough time thinking about how to get from here to there and how to make sure that we're meeting energy security and affordability needs along the way in a world that is nowhere close to on track for our climate goals. So it's helpful for the IEA to tell us if we were on track for our climate goals, we would not need to invest in new oil and gas supply. But we're not on track for our climate goals. Oil and gas use are going up every year, not down. And how do you make sure that you're keeping energy prices affordable and keeping supply available to people, but not taking steps that are going to make it much more difficult to get on track and have a faster transition? That's what we see the US doing. Biden is both putting $400 billion to work dramatically accelerating a reduction in demand for oil, while simultaneously threatening a windfall profits tax and promising to buy oil back for the SPR at $70 because he says, I want to see more US oil production as fast as possible. That highlights that tension between today's energy reality and tomorrow's energy ambition and climate ambition. And we just need to be able to struggle with that a little more and have a more honest conversation about how we're going to make that transition happen and how do you meet energy security and affordability needs. Because if you don't, that's not just bad economically and geopolitically, but to Kande's point, we're going to undermine support for the transition. You're going to see political instability. You're going to see, from Sri Lanka to iconic yellow vest protests in Paris, you're going to see a loss of public support for what we need to do if people can't afford energy.
Right. Yeah, people won't buy in, and it'll create its own problems. Varun, you wanted to say something, it seems? You want to add a little something?
First, look, there are things Jason can say that I can't say, but I thought that was a very coherent set of points. On the IRA in particular, this is an important moment to make sure that we're all thinking about this in an intelligent way. We hear a lot from our partners about the IRA, and we hear you, to all of our partners. There have been many who have thought that there are parts of the IRA that they'd want to change. But I just want to highlight a couple areas where I think the IRA is underappreciated in terms of its global impact. Globally, this IRA, because of the additional deployment of wind and solar in the United States, globally it will reduce prices of wind and solar, costs of wind and solar, by 2 to 4%. We just got early analysis this morning from Energy Innovation. And that's probably the tip of the iceberg. That 2 to 4% sounds small, but on an enormous base, it will translate to billions of dollars of savings around the world, including in emerging economies deploying clean energy. But the bigger cost savings are probably going to come from the emerging technologies. The IRA supports carbon capture, advanced nuclear, clean fuels, long duration storage. These will be technologies that will fall down the cost curve very quickly, clean hydrogen, because the United States is buying the expensive part. We're spending a lot of money to buy down the technology cost of these emerging technologies so the rest of the world gets to deploy them much more cheaply. That will speed transitions around the world. So that's just one mechanism for how the IRA reduces the world's cost. It's in effect the United States, by paying the expensive part of the energy transition, the United States is subsidizing the rest of the world to decarbonize by using cheaper technologies after we bring down the costs. The second mechanism is we are already seeing it by the United States passing the IRA. You're seeing other countries, in an effort to compete and keep up, passing even more ambitious climate policies. This is a principal mechanism for reducing emissions, where a virtuous competition cycle, whether it's us with our partners in Europe and Canada and China, etc., countries competing to have the clean energy industries of the future will end up driving down technology costs and making it cheaper for everybody. The one fear that Jason brought up is very valid, or actually Jason brought up a couple, but one is particularly prominent, which is this fear of protectionism, that a wave of, let's say, tariff barriers around the world pops up in response to the IRA. That's something that American foreign policy will work very hard to make sure it doesn't happen, because that impeding the free flow of clean energy goods and services is the one thing we can do to drive up costs of the clean energy transition. And that's a dangerous prospect.
Yeah. Well. Thank you, Jason. Do you want to say something or just? I think we might have lost you for a second.
Now it's on. Okay.
Okay.
A multi-decade process of transition to get to net zero. So we have many decades. We need to completely rethink how we define energy security. If you think of what is energy security, where does it come from, what provides it, we have a set of tools that were developed a half century ago after the Arab oil embargo, like the International Energy Agency and a sharing agreement to hold strategic stocks and release them. They're just not fit for purpose anymore, right? After the pandemic, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and in the midst of this incredibly volatile process, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to bet on technology and get them wrong. We're going to transition to an intermittent grid. We're going to have policy swings from Obama to Trump to Biden. Who knows what comes next? It's going to be a very, we're trying to flip on its head a massive share of the global economy, the entire energy sector, in just 28 years. It would be fanciful to think that that's going to be smooth. And we need a whole new toolkit to figure out how you get more energy security. And to Varun's point, it's not just protectionism, it is also a recognition that dependence on China for refining 90% of your critical minerals is probably not a good idea. So if you're an automaker and you wake up one day and you discover that you can't have a car without a steering wheel, and all my steering wheels come from one country, and that might be a risk to my supply chain, I think you have three options. You can decide you want to source your steering wheels from 10 different companies. You can say, I want to have a 2-year stockpile of steering wheels on hand at any given time, and I'll pay for that. Or you can decide I want to build a steering wheel company. And we're kind of in the energy sector trying to figure out which of those we want to do. How do we think about diversification of supply? And I think the risk would be that we decide security comes from making everything yourself, right? Making your own steering wheels. Because we're going to need so much more trade in clean energy components and technologies for the scale and speed we need. The numbers are mind-boggling when you think about what net zero 2050 looks like and how much stuff we have to build and how much infrastructure we have to build, from critical minerals to green hydrogen. And we're going to need so much more trade. We're going to have to figure out how to do that while recognizing that there are real risks to heavy dependence in supply chains for everything, including clean energy.
Yeah. No, thank you. Well, all of that is, government policy, right? That you and Varun were talking about. I want to go back to the private sector a bit, Bernard, and come back to you. Renewable energy technology and costs are really trending down in all regions. This is something that we really try to make clear in our stories, that there's a myth out there that, that some of these green energies are more expensive than fossil fuels. That's not always the case anymore. So what steps are companies like yours taking to ensure that in developing markets, access to technology, capacity, resources is really readily available to help bridge access, the access gap for countries that are transitioning?
Yes, let me give a perspective about how we think as a corporation and what we're doing in different markets based on the Inflation Reduction Act, or how actually we can intake in order to deploy a responsible energy transition in every market or customer that has set targets for a carbon-free emission. First, in AES, our mission is accelerate the future of energy together. Emphasis in acceleration that we're trying to aim is actually accelerate those targets in order to come early. We did it ourselves, and I will come in a minute. And all together, because could not be achievable without commitment of the corporations to develop the projects, governments and authorities in order willingness in order to provide the framework and the incentive to that happen, and bilaterals and multilaterals that actually finance these developing in developing countries and in emerging countries. This need to happen all at once. AES in 2016 decided that they are going to be a carbon-free energy company. Just to give a background of AES at that moment, we were 45% coal thermal producer of energy, of electricity. Today, we're less than 20%, and we're aiming to be zero coal by 2025. We put that target first in 2040, 2030, we're moving up, and now it is 2025. During that journey, we start to work in co-creation with Google and the Department of Defense in order to create solutions that are 24/7 every minute of the hour carbon-free energy. And we took the opportunity to work with them. Our first project that is in operation today in the island of Kauai, in the state of Hawaii for the Department of Defense, is 24/7 energy, clean carbon-free energy all hours of the day. We bring that and we work during a year with Google in order to announce last year, first with Google in April 2021, and then in November 2021 in COP26 with Microsoft, in order to actually provide solutions that are 90% every minute of the hour in order to provide carbon-free energy. We actually are taking that because we see the Inflation Reduction Act as a booster for what we actually can do with this. We are actually embracing projects for green hydrogen because we have the technology for every minute in order to do it in US, but also to do it in Brazil, to also do it in Chile. Transitions of energy and security of energy, it means different in every country and in every market and for every company. When you look at a case like Dominican Republic that we are mailing an Americas company, we move from diesel, we bring LNG in order to reduce the carbon emission in Dominican Republic. We're going to have everything in LNG, and now we're moving in order to actually bring renewables. Has been more than 15 years since we started with diesel, then LNG, gas, and now moving to renewables. In Chile, we have 5,000 of megawatts of coal facilities that each of them have a decommission date and have the same level of investment and commitment in renewable solar that is abundant in Chile, but short in transmission. So we're building also energy storage to do that. In Brazil, Colombia, and other countries, there are hydro countries. Hydro is also have an adversity in climate change. You can have a very dry year, and you can have actually very wet years. We actually, with energy storage, a company of our Fluence, we developed a technology in order to have a virtual dam. We actually storage energy when we have exceed of water in order to actually be deployed in the peak hours in those countries in order to make it greener all the way through, rather than be replaced or fulfilled by coal or diesel in those particular countries. So if I need to sum up, yes, a scarcity of supply is there. Companies like ours are looking actually do the three aspects. We are investing in what we believe are the key components in the nearshoring in Americas, that is where we work, that we see a great opportunity in order to have the production of the equipment, parts, and panels that are needed inside and the manufacturing inside in Americas. The second point is a strategic relationship. We actually make an investment in a company that is called 5B. It's an Australian company that is prefabric panels. These panels are actually 1.5, 2 times the density of the traditional solar. So we actually have the double capacity in the same land and in the same interconnection point of in order to deal with the scarcity in that point. The other thing need to be going down in the supply chains. We want to lock from the raw material, secure the raw material all the way through the components and parts, because that will guarantee that we can actually fulfill not only the company needs, but our customers and market needs in order to actually be long. That was not something that companies actually take in order to have in the supply chain be long, in order that we can serve not only our demand, but also the demand of others in the markets and the customers that we operate. So we see a great opportunity. 24/7 is feasible and is affordable, and is only having the willingness of government and authorities to put the framework. Corporates like ours, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, that are actually doing a lot of development projects in those countries, emerging markets, in order to deploy the energy, and multilaterals and bilaterals, financial institutions that could provide the funding, because they are there in order to actually boost the development of those. More incentives like the Inflation Reduction Act and other incentives that other countries are adopting in a different way, not only for manufacturing and nearshoring, but also for the renewable energy that is needed in every market to protect the energy security.
Thank you. Well, we are just about at the end here. And to wrap up, I want to give each of you a challenge. If you could sum up in a couple of sentences what you would want the panelists, other panelists, the people in the audience, the people watching, what you want them to take away from this panel, but just what they need to know about energy transition and politics. So I'll give you like a few seconds to think about that. Let's try to keep it to a couple of sentences if you can, but if you need to go a little more, that's okay. But what you want people to take away from this. Why don't we start with you, Kanda? We'll...
Energy transition is very contextual for us in Africa. We need to use all our energy resources to meet our energy demand. The only continent where there is significant energy poverty still. We also sit on most of the minerals the rest of the world needs. We want to have solidarity with the rest of the world, but our energy needs are critical. 600 million people without access to electricity, 900 million people without access to clean cooking solutions. For stability in the world, for security in the world, our needs matter. We're already suffering from climate change. For stability in the world, we need to look at the energy needs of Africa to make the global transition smoother for everybody.
Thank you. Let's go to the other side, Varun. How about you? You know I was going to come to you.
Catch me off guard. Look, let me make one point. Technology will be critical to the energy transition, and we're in a really exciting place because technology improvements are cascading. It's like building a pyramid. I'm using an Egypt analogy. We've come to the point where we have cheap renewable wind and solar. Next, we're going to have cheap electrolyzers. Beyond that, we're going to have cheap fuel production capabilities that are truly cheap, clean, synthetic fuels. You stack all these together, and as the emerging technologies hit their inflection point on the S-curve, and your existing pyramid-based technologies get even cheaper, suddenly these magical things happen where you can decarbonize not just the easy-to-abate sectors, but the hard-to-abate sectors. We better prepare for that moment when we hit S-curves across all of these dozens of technologies and suddenly have to deal with a very complex system. But I'm fundamentally optimistic because technology is going to get us there.
Thank you. Bernard, let's go to you. How about you?
Yes, I think that I will say is energy transition require commitment, require endurance, and require perseverance. Technology is there, and we have demonstrated that 24/7 is feasible and is affordable. It's just matter about three angles that I have repeat all over again, and I will do it one more time. It's corporate commitments and willingness in order to do the development, government authorities to put the framework and the right incentives in place for those investments, and multilaterals and bilaterals that back up the development that is needed in emerging countries in order that we can accelerate and boost the developing countries in order to achieve a carbon-free energy every hour.
Thank you. Jason?
Climate is, everyone here, I think, believes at COP an urgent priority, and we've done a huge amount like the Inflation Reduction Act. But look what happens when there's a pandemic. Look what happens when there's an energy security challenge. European countries have already spent somewhere around 700 or 800 billion euros to deal with an energy security crisis. People move mountains when you lack the ability to heat homes affordably or provide any energy at all. We will never forgive ourselves if we look back and realize we missed this moment of crisis to combine the urgency of combating climate change with the urgency of providing energy security and meeting energy needs affordably and reliably, and say and recognize that if we accelerate a transition and reduce our dependence on globally traded hydrocarbons inevitably exposed to geopolitical risk, if it's not Russia this time, it'll be something else next time. So many of the things we need to be doing now move us in the direction both of decarbonization and also will make us more energy secure. So there's a global energy crisis, but there's a moment of opportunity here too if we can seize it.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everybody in the audience and everybody watching. You have been listening to Power Politics, brought to you by the Project Syndicate and Sustainable Energy for All. We've been broadcasting from COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. I'm Peter Pringerman, AP's Global Climate and Environment News Director. And I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been a really fun discussion. Thank you.